If you're fitting a new fork, building a bike from scratch, or as is quite common, you want to remove an ugly stack of headset spacers from above your stem, you're going to need to cut down your bike's steerer tube. Here's how to do it. The techniques I'm about to show you will be the same whether or not you're cutting down an alloy steerer tube or, and as in the case of this bike, a carbon fibre steerer tube. The only thing you might want to consider is the type of saw blade you use. There are carbon fibre specific hacksaw blades on the market. For instance, this one from Park Tools, which has a tungsten carbide edge to create a really neat cut that won't fray the carbon fibres. But if you do want to use just a standard hacksaw blade, the only thing to consider is to use a very fine tooth count on the blade itself. So this is a 32 TPI blade, so that's the finest you can get for a hacksaw. So that would be a much better bet when cutting a carbon steerer tube so as not to damage or fray the fibres. But we'll get on to that as I get to the actual cutting point shortly. So in terms of other tools you're going to need for the job, first and foremost, a saw cutting guide is a really good idea because that's going to enable you to get a really clean and straight cut. Let me show you one of those. This is what a cutting guide looks like. So this is designed to clamp the steerer tube through the middle to give the saw a perfect perpendicular cut line and can be clamped in the vise. Or I'm going to show you a real good time-saving tip later in this video as well, where this can potentially be used without taking the fork out of the bike. So other tools you're going to need, definitely a way of accurately taking a measurement. So tape measure, or better still, I find a steel rule is a really good way of getting an accurate measurement. A file or some sandpaper for finishing the cut at the end, and some masking tape and a Sharpie is a really good idea too. You'll see why in just a second. Also, don't forget, as we're cutting through things, some safety glasses, some gloves, and with the carbon fibre, potentially, you might want to wear a mask as well. Those fibres are nasty. You don't want to be breathing in all that carbon dust as you make your cut. We should be all pretty used to wearing masks by now, given the current pandemic situation. So yeah, one of those as well. Okay, so the old saying goes, measure twice, cut once. In the case of your steerer tube, I would even say measure 3 times, cut once, because once you've committed and you've cut that steerer tube off, there is no going back. You cannot put it back on again. So you need to be really sure that this is the position you're happy with and that you're good to go with that setup as it is. One thing also to bear in mind is this is a slightly controversial area, and that is whether or not you want your stem to have the top cap sitting absolutely flush on top of it, or whether you want to run one 5mm spacer above the stem. Now, check with your fork manufacturer's guidelines, but some manufacturers will actually specify a 5mm spacer must be used above the stem. And to be honest, I would always agree with that. I think that's a really good thing to do. It's a good practice to get into. The reason for that is because if you have your stem top cap sitting flush on top of the stem, in order for that top cap to work, and we'll come to this in a minute, it needs to have a gap of about 3mm between the underside of the top cap and the top of the fork steerer, in order to have that little bit of room to do its job, which is to compress the headset bearings. So that means, in order for your top cap to sit flush, the steerer tube is actually going to be sitting 3mm below the top of your stem, which, yeah, it's only 3mm, but it does mean that your stem is therefore not clamping fully on, or is fully engaged on the steerer tube. It has just got that little bit that sits proud. So from my own perspective, I always like to have the safety net of that 5mm spacer above my stem, which means that the cut line is going to be above the height of the stem, and you know that your bolts and everything are clamping solidly onto the steerer tube itself. Okay, so back to the measurement then. I'm going to pop my 5mm spacer on, as I said. The first measurement you want to make is that line where that spacer sits. It's very difficult to write on carbon fibre, so using a pen is tricky, and also there's a danger that when you pull the stem off, you're going to remove that line at the same time. So what I find is a good tip, just a small electrical screwdriver or whatever, the sharp edge of that screwdriver will be enough just to make a visible line in that carbon. So I'm just going to score gently into there. You're not trying to gouge deeply into it, just make a visible line. So that's step one. We've got now, if I pull that off, I can see clearly on there, there's my first line. Now we're not going to cut exactly on that line because I said we need that few millimeters for the top cap to work, but we'll come back to that in a sec. What we need to do now is to decide, are we going to take the forks out of the bike? Now I would always say if you can, that is the best practice because it just gives you full control when it comes to cutting down the steerer tube. However, there is a caveat to that, and that is that modern bikes quite often have the hydraulics all running internally inside fork legs and so on, and that can make it quite a faff to take your forks out because it will mean disconnecting hydraulic connections for the disc brakes and so on. Therefore, I'm going to show you a really good tip later in this video for how you can cut down your steerer tube without having to take your forks out. But for the best practice, I'm going to show you how to do it with the forks out of the bike, which on this particular example, because I'm in the middle of building this bike, I'm still able to do that. So I'm quickly going to whip these forks out and then we'll move on to the next step. Right, so with forks in hand, we're ready to move on to the cut stage, although there is a couple of little preparatory stages still to do. As I mentioned before, the measurement of this is crucial. You need to be really sure we're cutting in the right place. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pop my cutting guide into the vise. So these are designed to be clamped in a vise, get in there good and solid. You can also go around that way if you prefer to work that way, but I like to use mine in this orientation. And I'm going to slide my fork steerer through. Don't have to go crazy with the tension of this, otherwise you risk damaging the fork steerer. Literally just nip that up. For now, I'm not cutting anywhere near that. I'm just using it as a way of holding my fork. Okay, so I can see my little line that I scored on there nice and clearly. That was the point of that little score line we made. I'm going to measure back using an accurate guide. So I can see that's 24 millimeters exactly back from the top of my fork. And that's important because remember I said at the start of the video about the fork bung. That's really important to just factor in that little bit. There's 2 millimeters of height in the fork bung itself. Now that needs to be considered. We want 3 millimeters of height for the top cap to be able to do the compressing of the headset, plus we've got that 2 millimeters there. So I'm actually going to cut 5 millimeters below my score line. So that then gives me 24 mil plus the 5 mil I need for clearance for the top cap and for the compression cap to work. So that's 29 millimeters. Now, just to make it nice and easy to see when it comes to my cut, I like to use a bit of masking tape. This yellow masking tape is even better because it's lovely and bright. So what I tend to do is pop a bit of masking tape on the steerer, roughly in the area where I'm going to need to make my cut. Then, using a Sharpie, I'm going to measure back my 29 millimeters that I need and just draw a dot on the steerer tube at 29 mil. You just do not want to mess this stage up and end up having to buy a new pair of forks. So there's my cut line. Measure twice, measure 3 times, cut once. Double check it, yep. That's nice and neat on the dot of 29 millimeters. So there we go. So this is my setup phase now. I'll take the fork out. There's my cut line. Nicely, clearly visible on the masking tape. At 29 mil is the amount I'm taking off the top of my steerer. Now, when I pop that into the guide, it's really easy for me to see when that lines up with the saw slot mark. That's perfect there. But we can also double check that when we go to put the saw into the guide. So just nip that up. Again, don't over tighten that. It just needs to hold the fork secure so that it can't wobble. That's absolutely fine. And then I'm going to drop my saw into the cutting guide. And then I can also then look through here and I can see that that is landing neatly on top of my masking tape pen line there. Right, so before we plow on and actually make the cut, a couple more little points, and that's just around your personal safety really. Not a bad idea to stick a pair of gloves on at this point. Also, carbon dust is nasty stuff. You don't want to be breathing in too much of that. So it's a good idea if you want to be really safe, pop a mask on and a pair of glasses. But another thing you can do, which is another way of keeping that dust at bay, is as you start to make the cut, just give stuff a little bit of a dust with water, and that will stop that dust all sort of going into the atmosphere. So yeah, I'm going to go with that. So line up my saw blade again, check my cut line, we're all good to go. Now, best tip I can offer for the cut process is not to go at it like a crazy person, just go nice and steady. You don't even have to apply much pressure with a carbon steerer. Yeah, the saw blade is going to cut through there really easily. So nice and steady, light amount of pressure, nice controlled saw movements, and let the saw find its way through. And then we're going to have a little dust with some water, just to keep that dust at bay. There we go. Just a light spray will do. So as you can see, I'm not applying tons of pressure, letting the saw just do its thing. That'll also help the cut to be really neat, as well as the saw guiding the guide guiding the saw blade vertically. Just light pressure. You're going to hear the note change as you get towards the end of the steerer tube cut. So it just starts to make a slightly different noise as you get near the final part of the cut. And at that point, really take the pressure off even more. One of the good things about using masking tape for your measurement is actually that will stop the carbon fibers from fraying in that last little part of the cut when you finally break through. But just so you want to try and keep the pressure as light as possible there. Again, I'm going to give it a final spray with some water just to keep that dust down. And then you'll see in that final cut. Now, to finish that, we do want to just do one last process. We're not done just yet. We could do that with a file or on a carbon steerer, to be honest. Sandpaper does a really good job. So quite a coarse grit, or a medium grit, I should say, actually, this one. And then I'm just going to sand around the edge. Just be cautious if you have picked up any carbon fibers, just to sort of sand in the direction of the grain, just to keep those from fraying any further. But if you've used the masking tape in the way that I've just shown you, this should be, you should have ended up with a neat cut basically. And you can also just fold that into the inside as well and just work around the inside of that cut line. So you've got no sharp edges. There we go. The end result then is a cut that is nice and straight, smooth. You've got no frayed carbons, and you're good to go and remount your fork in the bike. Okay, so that's our fork steerer, perfectly neatly cut and ready to refit into the bike. But before I do, I just wanted to touch on just that point about the difference between an aluminium steerer tube and a carbon steerer tube. As you saw, it was very easy to cut through a carbon steerer tube. It will take a bit more effort to cut through an aluminium one, but essentially all the processes will be exactly the same. Just bear in mind though, that star-fangled nut that's inserted into an aluminium steerer. If you're cutting down an existing fork, it's likely to be, or potentially, in an area where you're going to end up cutting into the star-fangled nut. So yeah, that is definitely something to watch out for if you're cutting down an aluminium steerer, and you just need to tap it down inside the tube a little bit to make sure you're clear. Okay, so I promised you a really good insider tip on potentially being able to cut down your fork steerer tube without taking the forks out of the bike. So I'm going to run through that now. Okay, first thing you're going to need to do for this is change the orientation of your work stand. I'm assuming you're using a work stand, I hope so. I'm going to tip the bike through 90 degrees like so. Okay, so now we can work on our forks in situ in the bike. What I want to be able to do though is hold that fork solidly in the bike, and for that I'm going to use a couple of nice sturdy zip ties. So I'm actually going to zip tie the fork to the down tube at this point. Okay, so now I'm certain that we've got our forks nice and securely fastened into the bike, so even when I take the stem off, nothing's going to fall out or move. So that's the next step. So loosening the stem bolts, which I've already done, now I can just ease that stem off the steerer tube and just before we take the bars off completely, it's worth considering we need to mount these somewhere now out of the way. So what can be really useful is to have a piece of pipe lagging or a rag, whatever, so that we can look at when we take these bars off, we don't just want them swinging around basically. That's going to be really annoying when we go to make the cut. So you just want to secure them somewhere, so against one of the frame tubes or the fork leg. And for that, an old toe strap is a really good idea. A little bit more environmentally friendly than zip ties, because we can use these again and again. Or tape, I suppose you could use in the absence of anything else. But yeah, just secure your bars somewhere out of the way and just check that they're sort of out of harm's way when we go to make the cut. Okay, I'm not actually going to cut this steerer because I'm just going to sort of use this as demonstrative purposes really for how this technique can be used. But we'll assume that you've made your accurate measurement, you know where your cut line is. Then what we're going to do is, like before, you can get your masking tape, pop that on. Check your measurement, which you know, nice and accurate. Again, I'm just mocking this up for the purpose of this video. So I'm just going to make a cut line on the masking tape there. Then what you can do is take your steerer tube cut guide, pop that on, line that up with your cut line, like so, and just snug that up. And there, straight away, you can see how it's possible to now have a really kind of accurate way and a safe way to cut down a steerer tube without having taken the fork out of the bike. One thing you do want to do though is just protect your components from any of that carbon dust. You don't really want carbon dust finding its way into your headset cups and so on. So I would wedge some rag into those areas. You don't want that to be damaging your frame either, so use another rag just to protect from any movement there. Don't take any chances, keep all that nice and clean and clear. And then finally we can take our hacksaw, and I'm in the perfect position there to support the bike. The forks are held by the zip ties anyway, but we can support all that and make a steerer tube cut exactly as we need to in an accurate and controlled fashion. And yeah, that's just a really good way of potentially cutting down a steerer tube with the forks still in the bike. Okay, so that's the stressful part over. Your cut's all made, and all that's left to do now is to refit that fork back into the bike. Before you do though, do make sure to give everything a good wipe down. You don't want any of that carbon dust, if there's any errant carbon dust around the place, to get into your headset bearings. That's not ideal. So yeah, a good wipe down, maybe just a bit of a spray off with some degreaser, and then wipe those surfaces with a rag thoroughly, just so you're sure everything's nice and clean to refit. Worth greasing as well, light coating grease on that lower bearing race, especially if you've got an aluminium crown race on there. That's definitely worth greasing. Not quite so critical with the carbon ones. And as well, you're going to refit your fork bung. I'm going to just pop that in there and tighten that up. Right, when you come to actually insert the fork into the head tube, a couple of things to have ready. The headset top cap is one, and also your handlebar stem arrangement and an Allen key, or in this case a Torx T25, ready to just do up the stem bolt. Because what you want to be able to do now is hold everything in place. So as the fork locates itself into the headset, you want to get that top cap on, and then really, at this point, you definitely want to get your stem on, because if I let go right now, there's a chance the fork could just drop straight out of the frame and damage itself against the floor. So you want to get that stem into place as quickly as possible and just nip up gently one of the bolts, just so you can get to that point and you're pretty much hands-free then, everything's in place. Now you can check, moment of truth, how accurate you were with your measurement, because if you've done this correctly, it should leave you with that gap, the 3mm gap that we measured, in order for the top cap to sit neatly on there and do its job, which that is the case, thankfully. So we can just nip that down, and all you want to do at this point is just nip that top cap bolt up. And then all that's left really is to pop everything back together, get the front wheel back in, and then you can set your headset preload, If you want to know how to do that, we've got a video for that on the channel already. I'll pop a link to that in the description below. Hopefully you found this video useful. If you did, please give us a like and subscribe to the channel. It costs absolutely nothing and it will really help us to carry on to make informative content for you in this way. And if it's more content you're after, also head over to cyclist.co.uk for all the latest news, tech and in-depth product and bike reviews. Thanks for watching.